Hello, everyone, and welcome back to LATAM Expansion Insights, which is your go-to podcast for all things related to growing your business in Latin America. So I'm Chris Danks. I am the founder of the Leadership Collective, and we help HR leaders all across the world in supporting them day to day within their roles in a variety of different areas within our community. So in the previous episodes, we took a deeper dive looking specifically at how to set up your operation and business within Latin America. So looking at things like legal entity setups, employer of record setups, and the different options available to you. Today, we're going to take a slightly different track and look at the cultural differences and norms across Latin America. We're going to highlight a few countries, specifically Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, which is where our guests, Becky and Casey, have experience and should be able to offer some value to you. So I would like, first of all, just to welcome back Becky Ospina. So Becky is a founding member of the Leadership Collective with over 20 years of HR leadership experience, and Casey Dudley, a HR leader who has navigated across Latin America for a while now, and hopefully both our guests here today will be able to offer you some great insights across the region to help you within your businesses. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining today, Becky and Casey. So the first question I really want to ask you, and I'll put this to you, Becky, to kick us off. So at a broad level, you have a lot of experience working within the Latin America region as a whole. I know it's a very broad geographical area, but just to kick us off, if we're talking slightly holistically, maybe you can just highlight a few of the experience you've had when navigating the business from the US into Latin America from a kind of cultural perspective. What kind of things have you run into?
Thanks, Chris. I would say from my experience, and I think it's important to point out, this is all based on my experience working directly in Latin America, is some key cultural differences are the way in which so you can think of just something simple as communication and interaction. I think in the US, we tend to be very transactionally focused, and you get on the meeting and you get things done. You're on your one-on-one, you're going to do a review, and it's all business, and you're just wanting to get through the conversations and address what needs to be addressed, accomplish what needs to be accomplished. But the communication styles can vary throughout the globe, especially in Latin America. There is a lot more emphasis put on relationship building and kind of laying the foundation and the groundwork. And, at the start of meetings, it's not necessarily just all business all the time. There is value in some of the getting to know you questions and conversations that I think in the US, we don't put a lot of value on, or it's just not something that's necessarily at the forefront of our culture. And so it can be interpreted as being non-productive time or non-productive conversations. Okay, why are we spending meeting time talking about the weather or a particular holiday that's coming up, maybe in a regional location where the employees that are on the meeting are? But those things actually are of value, and it's really important in building trust and building the relationship and opening lines of communication.
When I've worked in all different regions and experienced chatting with new employees or potential employees, or maybe frustrations that happen between existing employees from different regions, a lot of it is around communication styles and the expectations that we have ingrained in ourselves as individuals from our cultural upbringing. It's almost innate. And what I heard you explaining was really that many Latin American countries are what is called high context. So that means that because of their relationships that they've built over time, maybe because they're spending a lot of time at dinners or after work, spending time with each other's families, they've built these really tight-knit relationships. And so they might not describe things in the same level of detail that people in the United States or people in Western Europe would use when explaining their expectations or their processes. So it's really important when you're working in an environment with folks from a different region to make sure that you are speaking the same kind of almost dialect as each other to make sure that you understand the expectations when you're making an agreement. I'd also say that one thing I've noticed in Latin America, and that sometimes takes people off guard from the United States or Western Europe, is the expressiveness that Latin American individuals use. And a lot of U.S. employees will come to me and say, "Oh, like that person was shouting at me." And I'm like, "Well, were they shouting at you, or were they showing expression? Was it anger, or was it excitement?" And so I think that really understanding the different ways people communicate from different regional areas is a really important aspect. And it's often put on the HR team to make sure that our existing employees know what to expect there.
Casey, I love the way you explain that. I think you really hit the nail on the head, and something we've looked at in a tool, and it's not often talked about. People talk about IQ, people talk about EQ. Well, now people are talking about CQ, which is cultural intelligence. And there are tools out there. Our company used one specific tool that really helped to explain differences around these specific topics. They are so intangible. And you're right, we're making generalizations that may not apply to every specific person. You know, everyone has their own background and lens that they're looking through. But I think having the cultural intelligence, that CQ element, is something that, you know, we bring to the table and HR teams are often charged with, to your point, and something good for us to be thinking about.
I also love that when you think about from a global organization perspective, we want leaders that we always say high EQ, but we certainly mean CQ when it comes to global organizations. And that's why large global organizations will seek to expat someone for at least a year or two so that they can be exposed to a truly different culture and ultimately become a better leader because of their experience. And so I think that I love that movement and excited to learn more about it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think something, Chris, that, you know, should be mentioned is when having expanding in a new country or a new region, I think there's a real importance on the element of being open-minded and learning. We think about, you know, one of a element of a great leader is a lifelong learner. And this to me fits right in with that model, because it's really about learning what is kind of the cultural norms in the new place that you're expanding your business and where you're going to have employees. And so there's always going to be nuances. And I think an aspect of a great leader is being able to flex that, even if it's not exactly matches your leadership style or your communication style, but being open and willing to learn, I think, is a key element of success. I've been on the other side of the coin where an organization says, we're a US company, everybody needs to get on board with the US way of doing things, with the US way of communicating, with how we manage projects. And ultimately, the organization was not successful with that mindset. It's really about the organization finding success. If the new region, the new geographical location is a key part of the business strategy, it's important to have the mindset that matches that. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're trying to change your corporate culture or you're adapting everything. That's kind of, you know, the pendulum swinging to the other end. It just means really about open-mindedness and learning. And I will tell you, a little bit of effort goes a long, long way into kind of building the bridges in new regions with new employees in other countries.
Becky, you shared there that if the new expansion is a strategic move, if it's important to your organization. And I think that that's a good place to highlight too, So if you're hiring one person in this country, one person in this country, one person in this country, I think a general cultural awareness of your team members is good. If you are opening a legal entity or a large ERO operation, then a deeper dive is necessary. The people who are leading those team members, so if you have US team members leading team members in LATAM, those leaders need that additional deep dive on cultural training so that they can prepare to have performance conversations with them, navigate employee issues that pop up, and even talking about compensation and the sensitivities around that in the different areas. And so I think that a organization's approach does depend on the purpose of setting up that EOR or legal entity.
So, but some really interesting insights there. And I think, what about from the other perspective? So, if your teams across the region, I guess some of the team members and some of the teams may have experience working with, for example, US headquartered organizations, and some may never have done, depending on their area of expertise and their background. Have you experienced differences depending on whether the team members themselves have worked with US organizations and them knowing how to navigate the other way around?
Yeah, so I'm actually experiencing this right now, and for our India operations, not for a LATAM operation, but onboarding is important for every single new hire. It is even more important when you're bringing on an employee from your first hire in a new region. And you need to make sure that you're setting them up for success and setting up their leadership team for success. So whenever you're building out your roadmap for what the new hires will look like, what their skills are, what their expertise is, you also want to evaluate what their experience is in global setting, and what kind of extra support they might need. I think that another really important aspect is not just the way US employees interact with people in other regions, but also what are our organization's values and norms. And so what are your expectations around your hours working? And what are your expectations on answering a Teams message or a Slack message immediately? And what does our performance review process look like? And how do we provide feedback? And so I think that, yes, it can be tailored region to region, but in my opinion, the most important thing is laying out the expectations of the organization, regardless of the region that you're focusing in.
I would definitely agree, Casey. I think those are excellent points. I always say communicate early and often. And so I think one part of just, US corporations is we tell people something once, one time, and we said, remember 9 months ago, we rolled the strategy out to you. Don't you remember at that all hands meeting when we shared we were going to do X? Now we're doing it. And that doesn't always translate across borders. And also keeping in mind, sometimes English is not always the first language. And so while there can be appearing to understand and certainly on board with the vision and the strategic direction of the organization, giving an opportunity to have two-way dialogue, giving an opportunity to ask questions, but communicating early and often and in different ways. And so some cultures, you're going to get a PowerPoint for every discussion. You're going to get slides. Others, you're never going to have slides. It's going to be purely dialogue. And so being able to meet those different communication styles, it could be something cultural. It could be a learning style. It could be a communication method. Sometimes people read things and absorb versus listening, but making sure you're getting and catching all of the spectrum of how that could happen. Again, just looking at it, well, we had an all hands and we told everyone, so now they all know the strategy, doesn't necessarily work, especially crossing borders. There could be cultural customs in place where, and I've seen this particularly in Latin America, where strategies are discussed multiple times and employees are asking questions, and there's just really that two-way dialogue. So ensuring that happens. Sometimes it can be interpreted, oh, they're not on board with the vision, or they're not on board with the strategic direction. Awareness is not alignment. And so making sure that the opportunities are given, they might not be up for debate, but just to ask questions and the understanding is really there. I think a lot of times when questions are asked, it's interpreted as dissent. But when you get outside of the US, could not be farther from the truth. Questions would be a very normal part of the daily business interactions. And so understanding that and not necessarily interpreting that from our own cultural point of view and exploring what that means in other countries.
What about yourself, Casey? Does that resonate with what Becky's just been saying from your perspective?
Yeah, I was reflecting and thinking about the concept of individualism while you were sharing, and how to maintain authority in an individualistic environment. And I think it's definitely a line to walk. So, and if we're generalizing, folks in Latin America are individualistic. They are self-focused, similar to the U.S., where we put ourselves first. We would like growth, and we want to continue to move forward. And so I think that kind of ties into those asking questions. So let me understand the what's in it for me. So you said awareness is not understanding, and I could not agree with that more. And it ties directly into my thoughts about change management, and any kind of strategy that you're rolling out throughout an organization goes through a pathway. I'm trained on the pro side change management process, which starts with awareness, then goes to desire, then to knowledge, then to ability, and then to reinforcement. And so if you think about that, and it is supposed to work across cultures, is sure, we're telling you it's happening, but what's in it for me? And often in LATAM cultures, they are, employees are more likely to do something if they are in on the decision, that it's been made with them in mind, and they feel like they're contributing to the goal. So this is what I need you, Alice, to do in this role so that we can hit our strategic goals. This is what I need you, Tom, to do to help us reach our goals. And really sharing with them what the part they play is. People in Latin America do want direction, but they want to be part of the conversation. And I don't think that that's much different than in the United States. So I think that, having those conversations, you still managing them, but treating them as an individual, I think is really important.
Well, and I think you raise a good point, Casey, around when you're looking at legal entity and EOR setups is, are you looking at this as just a cheap outsourcing solution? If it is, that engagement's going to look very different, but you're also going to see a different performance level, right? When you look at that two-way relationship, and so those kinds of decisions and understanding what you're doing. And really, to me, it's about being intentional. Okay, this is an EOR. We are looking at, we're going to try this out for 12 months. We're going to hire 5 employees in this market, in these specific roles, and having some intention around that. Okay, well, that kind of level of investment will probably get this level of result versus this is a legal entity, we're here long term. Those messages, how they're communicated to the employees will also, the way it's received, contribute to the performance levels as well. And so I think in the US, we kind of sometimes look at these as, affordable labor outsourcing solutions. But on the other side, and the employee side on the ground in that geographical location, that is not necessarily a positively received message. And the performance levels and engagement can often reflect that. So one thing that we did to kind of counteract that is when we spoke about expansion, whether it was an EOR, whether it was a trial, whether it was one person in one country, whether it was a legal entity set up, we would try to speak about it all in the same way around an investment in the organization, growth, strategic direction. There were never, sites that were, okay, these are outsourcing. No, these are insourcing. These are our employees. These are our contractors. Everybody was spoken about and contributed in the same way. And that really had such a positive effect on our culture, regardless of what things looked like behind the scenes. And the long-term strategy was really important to gain that buy-in engagement from the employees.
I love that insight. And I think that that's something that I can take with me, because what you talked about early on about being a relationship oriented culture in general, Latin America, is if they feel other than, like they're not part of your organization or part of your culture, of course that's going to impact them and the way they perform. And so people in Argentina, for example, are very people oriented, not task oriented. So if they feel like they're doing a favor for their colleague and like, hey, we're in this together, they're more likely to be receptive of it. Where if they are getting a direction from someone who's never talked to them before, it's going to be like, who are you? Who are you telling me what to do? And so I think in Latin America, when you're looking at your EOR solutions, it probably is really important to focus on treating them like an employee, not like an outsourced resource.
How do you guys, you talked a lot about the bringing together the culture and from a leadership standpoint and communication and things. Are there certain ways that you've been able to influence the interaction between the employees themselves and, internally kind of peer to peer across both regions as well? Is that something that you've been able to influence, I suppose?
Yes, Chris. We talked about, Casey mentioned earlier around if it's kind of one person in one country or a legal entity with a whole office or manufacturing site set up, around the level of that cultural awareness training. And I think the same thing applies in peer-to-peer relationships. If you have two project teams, one in Mexico, one in Brazil, and they are going to be working on a project daily for 9 months, there definitely needs to be some cultural awareness training. If they're going to be on one meeting once a month where they're really getting updates, it's probably the level and the depth is going to reflect that. And that would be my recommendation, is depending on the time commitment, the time length, and the level of interaction, the training should reflect and mirror that. And I will say the same challenges leaders have communicating with folks across borders, employees have the same exact challenges, right? Because they're coming from that same lens. And so to think that the peer-to-peer, that shouldn't matter what culture they're in or what country they're in or what their background is, I think is a little bit obtuse and kind of putting your head in the sand of the situation. Well, I'm giving them direction and they should just all follow it and do what they need to do and solve this problem and come back to me and let me know what they did. That is a little bit naive to think that that could happen with no direction, no training, no cultural awareness, kind of the CQ level. I would say probably that's at the elementary level. Many of those folks may not have had a lot of working exposure globally. And so to set everyone up for success is really around an organization-wide movement as far as being on board, not just with the strategic direction, oh, that's happening to this department over here, that doesn't affect me. No, it affects the whole company. We're all in this together. We're on team company, right? And buying into that long-term vision. And so making sure those messages and the training is reaching all of the right people, not just the direct frontline managers.
Agree. I think that company-wide cultural training, cultural sensitivity training, you might call it, is very important in global environments. In global matrixed environments, I think that you can get even more focused. And so at my organization, one thing that we like to do when we're looking at our project teams that could be people made up from 17 different countries at a time is doing kind of a kickoff meeting where you start to understand each other's working style and the cultural influences on that working style. Currently, I use two different tools to look at that in my matrix work groups. I use Aperion, which looks at your cultural norms and cultural competencies, and then Predictive Index that looks at your work style. And by talking about those things, and you can actually combine them together and look at them in this holistic way, you can pinpoint areas that might cause concerns down the road and areas of strength that your teams can really focus on. And so by incorporating things like this, it really gives you a lot of knowledge and power to help support your teams. So that's like the kind of serious look that we take on it. We also like to offer a really fun way that's more optional. So while cultural training baseline level would be a requirement, we also give people opportunities to interact with people from other cultures in a more loose environment. We call them cafeteria chats. They usually happen either in the morning time in the US or lunchtime in the US to try and make it as available as possible. Every once in a while, we'll do an evening one that could really focus on our Asia Pacific employees, and then US Central Time employees might hop on at 9, 10 p.m. their time, and maybe they're having a glass of wine instead of a cup of coffee, and we give them topics to talk about, and then they get to go into breakout rooms and have these conversations and really get to know the differences of the people that they're working with in a really safe environment. I would say a caution with that is conversation topics in one country are not always welcome as topics in another country. And so you might want to give them some prompts and some things to talk about that are safe zones for all the different people that you're talking with.
Fascinating, yeah. Have you just talking about hiring as well? So on the recruiting side, have you had to adjust the way in which you recruit, or do you pretty much follow the same process, same way of hiring that you would do in the US or in other countries? Or do you adapt it, or do you keep it pretty much the same?
From my perspective, there are additional cultural elements that are added across all roles in all countries, because you don't want to hire someone in at the corporate office or the corporate headquarters that is, not a good match for the global environment, and kind of vice versa. And so Casey had touched around just ensuring kind of the global experience. It doesn't mean someone who hasn't had global experience isn't a good fit. It just means spending extra time diving into, are they going to be a good match for the way in which that country is going to be set up? Are they one person in one country that can often feel like an island? Are they part of a brand new site in a new country? Are they part of a site that's been long established and has 20 years of history? All of those things matter to fitting. I look at it as puzzle pieces, fitting that in for a good match across the company. They could have all of the skills and competence. They could have all of the leadership traits, but there could be a piece around the global environment that may not be the best fit. And so making sure you're putting enough emphasis on the environment in which they're going to work. Some folks are great being the only person in that country. They know how to use their resources to find answers. They know how to reach out when they need help. Others, that would never, ever work. And so making sure that there's a lot of awareness when you're setting up hiring profiles, meeting with the hiring manager, the hiring teams, and that you're looking at all of those elements during the talent acquisition process.
Yeah, I think that hiring in different countries does require expertise. So your recruiters in-house may have that expertise, and if so, good on you for finding that and hiring that person to support in your talent acquisition. We often prefer to work with recruiters in those markets to help us find talent and to also make sure that our compensation is aligned. Compensation in LATAM countries can vary greatly and they often change frequently. And so being on top of that is something that's really important for the business to keep in mind. And one thing Becky shared, and I could not agree more, is taking the time to make the right hire. So unlike the US, at-will employment is not always common in LATAM. And you may have a trial period or a decent probationary period for a new hire. But once you get past that trial period or probationary period, you're going to pay significant severance or notice period pay if you would like to separate with an employee. And so vetting them in the recruitment process is extremely important, and having clear measurable outcomes during that first 60, 90, and 180 days is also important. So it's an ongoing evaluation to make sure that you protect your company's assets as well.
See, I think you touched on something there that, so, you know, as you both know, we recruit an awful lot across the Latin American region as a whole, in all over really, Mexico, Colombia particularly, and a few other countries. One of the things that I see come up that might almost be stating the obvious, but I would say at least 50% of the time is, Casey, you touched on it, where businesses will try and start hiring. And by the time they get to the offer process, I would say, like I said, about 50% of cases, the hiring manager, the HR person may not be fully aware of the detail of the offer that they need to put through for that individual to ultimately get them bought into, you know, to signing the employment contract and joining their organization. It can be things like just the, you know, maybe lack of awareness of things like 13th month salaries, all these nuances that, you know, will seem a little bit alien if you've not recruited in these regions before. But the perception that then gives the candidate, it can really affect, you know, your ability to bring them on board. I've seen this very often. And the other component of this is where organizations will look at the legal minimum requirements to bring someone on board. So they'll say, right, the legal minimum benefits are X, Y, and Z. So they'll pick those out and say, right, well, we only need to offer 20 days holiday. We only need to offer, you know, this kind of healthcare. Well, that might be the legal minimum, but, you know, the actual expectation is always different. And again, it's another way to by not getting that right, it really affects the candidate experience so much. It gives the perception that actually this organization doesn't really know my country, my, you know, my culture, and so on. Even though we're talking here outside of LATAM, but I'll give you a good example in Germany, just because it comes up all the time, where the legal minimum is, I believe, depending on the region in Germany, but it's around 25 days a year. But it's almost, I've not seen an organization once offer anything less than 30 days. And if you say to someone in Germany, you know, we're only offering 25, you'll get all kinds of reactions. And it's just that knowledge and working with your recruiter to really bring this together, and indeed your legal entity setup company that you're working with, or your employer of record, they will have this data as well, depending on how you're operating. I think that's really, really important. And just one other point on this, I would agree about the on the ground recruiting. I think it's imperative to have someone who's they don't necessarily have to physically be in the country, but, you know, have worked in that country, speak the language, do the recruitment itself in the local language, not necessarily in English, even though you might be an English speaking organization. You know, those really straightforward things I see affect things more in places like LATAM across the board than they do in places like Europe, because actually in Europe, there's more commonality. That, you know, there are differences and there are some kind of nuanced things that you need to do, but it's not as different. Whereas I think in LATAM, I see it very commonly, and in Asia as well, actually, different parts of Asia where the whole setup is so different. So I just wanted to add that, because I think you're spot on with that point. I think it's something that it's actually not a hard thing to solve. It's just a question of being organized before you get to an offer stage. You know, you've got a few weeks to do that normally, but as you're going through the process, to make sure that you truly understand all the details about what people are expecting from you as an organization.
Right. Do you want to be competitive, or do you want to make a bare minimum offer? And I think that's another strategic decision too, right? So if you expect high turnover in this role, maybe you will offer the bare minimum, and that's just what your expectation is. But if you want someone to stay for years and add value to your team and be a strategic team member, then you need to put your very best foot forward. And so I think that those are decisions and conversations you should have with your leadership team, and then ultimately with your recruiter, whether that be in-house or an external recruiter.
I think there's the commercial element, which you just highlighted, but there's also the other component is the perception that it gives off. It's just that, it's not even about the benefit itself sometimes. It's just, for example, I use the 13th month. I've seen cases where people aren't aware of that at the offer stage, and the potential employee, the candidate, will sit there and go, wow, they don't know about the 13th month. What else don't they know about my country as well? So it's I think there's a combination of things, like you said, Casey. It's a strategic thing as well. It's a combination, but something that I see a lot, too often, really. So hopefully this insight will help people avoid that mistake. It's really not a hard thing to solve, but it's something that's easy to miss if you're not used to hiring in the region. You don't know what you don't know. So.
Well, I think, Chris, the word that keeps coming to mind is credibility. And when you are operating in another country, credibility is so key, because it's credibility during the talent acquisition process is also going to speak to credibility during the hiring, the onboarding. And to your point, what don't they know? And that will translate over to business operations as well. And when you start off on the wrong foot, it's very difficult to recover from that and establish that credibility, because later you're saying, yeah, we didn't do this part right, but no, we really know about this part. And so it's hard to convince people of that later. You kind of have one chance to make a good first impression, and the talent acquisition process is the best opportunity to make that good first impression. We're ready, we're knowledgeable, we care about this, we've invested in this. And so you should invest right back in us as well. I mean, it really sends that message around credibility.
I couldn't agree more, and it's one of the more simple things to get right when it's front of mind, compared to some of the more complicated things like setting up legal entities and some of the compliance things and everything. So it's a good opportunity to do something different than a lot of other organizations there. The other thing I would mention briefly about this is that the demand for talent ebbs and flows and fluctuates more vastly in different countries in LATAM generally. So if we take Mexico, for example, many countries across LATAM, since remote working's become a big thing and everything, that they're all growing at rate, as I'm sure many people know. But you do get ebbs and flows in the demand. So Mexico, for example, in 2021, just absolutely took off, and the salaries just shot through the roof within a few months. You couldn't even do salary benchmarking; it would be out of date within a few weeks because things moved so quickly. Then there was a period around about, I think it was the end of 2022 into 23, where actually people stopped going as readily to Mexico because of the cost that had gone up. And then people started looking at other countries like Colombia. So that kind of equalized things a little bit. So it's also, I think, important to understand the rate of change in those countries. In some of the countries in LATAM is just so fast, faster than it is in even the US and parts of Europe in that context. So it's something that you have to have your finger on the pulse on pretty much permanently if you want to hire the right people, but then also retain them as well. Salary levels are going to change. People do move for salaries in different countries. That it's a different level of priority in certain countries. And I think with that in mind, you've got to watch your salary, your equity across employees as well, to make sure that everyone's in alignment. So it's quite a difficult balance, I think.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about a little bit about the different countries. So we've talked as a whole about LATAM, which is a large continent, and as you mentioned earlier, we're making some generalizations, but maybe it'd be helpful if we can just zoom in onto some of the countries that you both have experience with. So Casey, do you want to maybe just kick us off and talk about the countries you've worked in within LATAM and what your experiences have been?
Yeah, so my experience primarily is with Argentina, Brazil, and just a little bit in Mexico. And Mexico is US's neighbor. And I've talked to y'all before of making the mistake of saying that because it's part of North America, it'll be like the US. I made this mistake with Canada, and I was adamant that I would not make that mistake with Mexico. So I think that that's a really important thing to consider, is just because it's a neighboring country, and especially as you move into South America or Central America, where there's several countries neighboring each other, there are core key differences within those organizations that tie back to their political and historic past. And so I would definitely educate yourself on those things before you move into an organization. So I would say that in Argentina, for example, talking about the cultural changes that have happened over the centuries is not an accepted practice. There are a lot of high tensions, a lot of opinions, and you want to make sure that you don't offend your employee or potential employee by bringing up one of those topics. On the other side of the coin, folks in Argentina are very likely to ask you about your marital status and how your family makeup looks, and that's them building a relationship with you. We talked before about LATAM in general being very relationship focused, and in Argentina that's definitely true. So you want to build those relationships, and that's one of the ways they do it. One thing that you mentioned earlier, Chris, that also comes to mind to me is speaking the language. And so while most of LATAM speak Spanish, and there's a good deal of English speakers in these countries as well, we have Brazil, whose primary language is Portuguese. And so just that's a small thing that would be a big mistake to make, is to go into a Brazilian interview and speak Spanish. It would immediately be insulting. You don't know anything about their culture, and they don't see seen or heard. And so really what I've experienced as I've worked with these different different countries is making sure that I refresh my memory, refresh my facts about these cultural norms before I go into conversations with the individuals. And you can do that on a holistic approach. So, okay, I have 50 employees in Brazil, and these are the key points I need to know about communicating in Brazil. When you have a smaller population, so if I only have 1 to 2 people in Brazil, I can say, I know this person is comfortable talking about these things. This is what I've shared with them about myself, so I can expect them to ask me about my dog and my husband. I know that I shared these things with this individual, and I can expect them to ask me about those things. And so in countries where relationships are important, I think it's important that you focus on that relationship too. So don't just understand that it's important to them. You have to make it important to yourself as well.
Fascinating. Yeah, really interesting. I've no experience myself personally in Argentina, so I definitely agree. It takes a while to get familiar with each country that you do work in. So it's been quite a learning curve for myself personally, where we've gone into different countries across LATAM, and the sheer difference between neighboring countries. Well, I personally visited a few of those countries. I'm lucky enough to have gone to some of them, and you cross a border and it's like an entirely different culture within 10 kilometers. It's a very interesting dynamic. Becky, what about yourself? Where do you have most of your experience across LATAM?
Okay, thanks, Chris. So the majority of my experience has been around Mexico, Colombia, Brazil. I loved what you were saying, Casey, around just neighboring countries, just as far as crossing borders and how things can be so different. One thing that came to my mind is the concept of company, team, and family. And a lot of times what you'll hear is employees refer to themselves as family. And that's something that I think in the US kind of, makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck when you hear that. Is like, we are not a family. Well, that is a big cultural difference, and it's not meant to mean anything else, but what it is as far as just how people think of themselves when they're on a team, when they're part of a company, and the level of loyalty, commitment, engagement is something very, very different. And I have seen that at different levels, whether you're in Brazil, whether you're in Colombia, whether you're in Mexico, those levels can vary. But I do think it's something to think about, because when we hear that, especially in the US, it's something we interpret it as being negative when it's not meant that way at all. It's something very, very positive when you get into Latin America.
Yeah, fascinating, Becky. I think that's pretty much all we're going to have time for today. But I do want to mention, I think we're going to do some more sessions with yourself, Becky, and with yourself, Casey, particularly on doing deep dives in those specific countries to look at more cultural differences and how to navigate them in a bit more depth. So today we spoke a lot about LATAM as a whole. We've talked a little bit about certain countries, but we're going to do different sessions, doing a deep dive into different countries across the region to give the audience here a little, some more specifics about handling different situations relevant to the particular countries that they're looking to move into. So thank you both very much. That was very, very interesting. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm hoping everyone enjoys the content, and look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.